Okay, we're now recording.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Kaye, and I'm coming to you from San Francisco, California. I will be running this Ayres Sensory Integration conversation, which is about theory, module number 1. And just for the record, it is the 30th of May, 2018. How the session's going to work is that I'll start with a short presentation, and we have about an hour, so I will try to keep it to about 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for questions and comments, etc. I'd appreciate it if you jot down your questions, and then when we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation, you can either go ahead and type your questions in chat, or you can unmute your mic and you'll be able to ask me directly. Sound okay? And if you'll just ring in just briefly, I see Jennifer, Lauren, Sarah, Teresa, and YYIV. If you can just ring in on chat and let me know that you can hear me, we will go ahead and get started. Great.
Yep.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, Lauren. Excellent.
I can.
And Sarah, I see. And YY, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing your name right, so if you'll just type in what you'd like me to call you, I will happily do that. Ivy, great. And Teresa, can you also hear? Perfect. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So some of this will be a review for you, and other information may be new. I'm going to go over it pretty briefly. Slow me down or stop me if you have questions along the way. So for today, we're going to use the definition of what is sensory integration, and we're going to take Ayres' 1972 definition, which is the neurological process that organizes sensations from one's body and from the environment and makes it possible to use the body effectively in the environment. And I like that definition because it talks about the neuro, which we'll focus on a little bit today. It also talks about the organization and integration of sensation. We bring in information from the environment because that will change and either augment or hinder how we make sense of sensory information that's coming in. And then we have this idea of using the body effectively in the environment. So that brings into perspective not only what we're going to do in terms of assessment, which is how we measure how well one's senses are working together, but also it informs how we're going to do treatment for individuals who may have sensory integration issues. I'm going to review a little bit of the sensory terminology with you. And what I find is that all of the terms, I've been studying sensory integration for about 20 years and have been certified in administering the SIPT, I think for about 9-10 years. So I've been hearing and seeing these words for a long time. And what happened for me, and I'm not sure if this is happening for you, is that the words kind of smushed together, and it was very difficult for me to actually divide them out and fully understand them in relationship to each other, and also how they're different from each other. So I'm going to take a stab at that, and if you have questions, please do let me know about that. So our first term is perception, and perception basically is the ability to distinguish and interpret sensation from any one of our senses. And you know well by now, I believe, that we are looking at 7 or 8 senses, depending on who you're talking to. So we have sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, proprioception, vestibular, and then the alternate or optional eighth sense is our sense of interoception. In other words, how we make sense and how we perceive information that's coming from our viscera, so our internal organs. And that has to do to a large extent with feeling hunger, feeling thirst, feeling the need to urinate or defecate. So we have these eight senses, and perception is the basic recognizing that something is happening. Discrimination is related to perception, but discrimination is kind of the fine tuning of understanding this idea of something is coming in from our senses. So when we discriminate, we are getting a more precise idea of what's happening with our senses and the information that is coming in through our sensory receptors into our central nervous system and up to our brains. The next term is registration. And registration has to do with whether or not our central nervous system notices the input. And this is not a conscious noticing. So it's not like our central nervous system says, oh, hey, I'm getting some rod and cone action in my eyes. I'm going to notice this. This is all unconscious, but it's whether or not the nervous system actually takes in the information and says something is coming in. So it's a very basic level of sensory processing. The next term is reactivity, which is also called modulation. And within the CLASI program, and also with regard to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so that's our book that that tells us all about any kind of mental health disorder, including autism spectrum disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as a slew of other disorders that may or may not really hook up with sensory integration. In any case, reactivity is the term that's used in that manual, and so we use it here to represent the regulation of arousal and our behavioral responses to sensory input. So when one is working in sensory integration, there's always this $6 million question of, is it behavior or is it sensory? So reactivity is how much we respond or how much behavioral or emotional output happens as a result of sensation coming in and being processed. Sometimes it's called modulation, but because the DSM calls it reactivity, that's the term that we're going to say is the one that we're going to be using. But you may also see the term modulation. And finally, processing is this umbrella term, which basically means that information has come in to any of the sensory receptors and it's started to be taken into account by the central nervous system. So it's moved from the sensory receptors and now it's in some way being made sense of, in other words, processed. There's a few additional terms that I want to review with you, and I'll do that again briefly, and then we'll move on to a couple other topics and finally open it up. So we hear in theory, also in terms of assessment and treatment, this idea of bilateral integration and sequencing. So I want to unpack that just a little bit, and if this is review, please bear with me. So bilateral simply means the two sides of the body, two sides of the brain. With the vestibular system, the vestibular system is very connected to bilateral integration because there are two vestibular apparatuses, one on each side of our head. So bilateral simply means two-sided. The integration, obviously, is the putting together of this information and making sense of it. And then sequencing is what we can do of ordering our activity and our responses to integrating information from the two sides of the body. So we see a lot that when kids or adults have difficulty with bilateral integration, they also tend to have difficulty with sequencing. If they can't put together the two sides of their body and make sense of information with the two sides of the brain, it's very difficult to string together any kind of motor activity. The next term is body scheme. And body scheme is basically this idea that every human has an unconscious map of their physical body that's stored in their brain. So to some extent, it's how we know where our body is in space, right? So related to the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, and the tactile system. But it goes further than that to include a mental idea of what our physical body looks like, feels like, and where it is in relationship to the environment. Another term that comes up fairly frequently is something called postural ocular control. And just as it suggests, it's the combination of our eyes, so ocular, and postural, meaning how upright are we and how well do we navigate our bodies against gravity to stay upright. And so postural ocular control ultimately is the motor control of our body position, and it is in concert with our eye movements. The next term is praxis, and praxis, very simply, is our ability to conceptualize and organize novel actions. So we separate out familiar actions or habitual actions from novel actions because when something becomes habitual, like for example, all of us have been walking for an awfully long time. So when we walk, it's not a novel action and we're not paying a lot of attention to it. So the brain processing or the neurological processing happens in a very different way. We're kind of on autopilot. Whereas if we're doing something new, say you decide to take up rock climbing or trampoline tricks, every motor activity that goes into that is brand new. And so we use praxis to conceptualize and organize our actions and then execute our actions. Then we come to a more Ayres Sensory Integration term, the just right challenge. So the just right challenge is any activity that facilitates skill building. So if we're working with a child, it facilitates that child's ability to gain new competence, motor competence, while simultaneously being responsive and adjustable to where they're functioning currently. So the just right challenge is not too hard and not too easy. It's just right. And in terms of treatment, this becomes extremely important because if an activity is too difficult, the child is not going to approach it or not persist with it. And if the activity is too easy, then the child is not going to gain new competence or new skill from engaging in the activity. Our next term is adaptive response. An adaptive response is a purposeful, goal-directed counteraction to a sensory experience. And for our purposes, the adaptive response is how we know if what we're doing therapeutically with the child is actually working. So it looks different depending on who the child is or the adult and what their set of challenges or difficulties are. So for the child that's pictured on this slide, it could be that an adaptive response is being able to remain upright against gravity, to pick up a block and to put it on top of the other blocks. An adaptive response for another kid could be that he can engage in a ball game or sit at the table and do some fine motor activity. So the adaptive response is really very individual to the child. And when we're assessing and coming up with goals, measurable goals, we look at what kinds of adaptive responses will indicate that this child is benefiting from therapy. All right. So, as part of my preparation for this conversation, I went through the entire module very quickly, um, and got a lot of neuro. And along the way came the question: why do we study neuro? Why is this the beginning, and why do we have so much of it? So here's my thoughts on that. First of all, understanding neurological function and structures helps give us insight into a child's development. And the best way for us to know whether or not a child, a client, is actually needing our treatment is to know about typical development so that we can then see when things are atypically developing. We also want to know if we see something clinically, why is this happening? So it provides us with this deeper sense of why are these things happening? Why is this child afraid of movement? Why does this child cover her ears when there are loud noises? Why does this child sit and have a very difficult time getting up and actually coming to the party and engaging with others? Why is he more comfortable just kind of being a couch potato? So this idea of increasing our physiological knowledge is informed by the study of neurology. It also grounds our assessment. So when we think about data-driven, our data-driven method for moving through sensory integration assessment and treatment, we want to ground our evaluation efforts in understanding what is happening in the body on a very basic level. It gives us a deeper and more robust idea of what's happening. It also informs intervention. So there are plenty of therapists, and I'm an occupational therapist, if you didn't already gather that. And I have had the pleasure to work with many very skilled occupational therapists, and also some therapists who are newer to sensory integration and will engage in intervention efforts that do not seem to be grounded in the study of neurology or the neurological underpinnings of sensory integration. And so what we want to do, and what this whole course seeks to do, is to give you a very solid foundation to understand the why of what you're doing. So it's pretty easy to put a kid on a swing, but if we don't know why we're putting that kid on the swing, we're not going to be able to very accurately determine, shall we swing quickly, slowly? Should we do a linear swinging motion? Should we go around in a circle? Should we have some sort of target? Should we sit with the child on the swing? How long should we swing? How frequently should we swing? So the study of neuro is the beginning of the knowledge that's needed to be a very skilled clinician. And then, I came up with this thought that when we're talking to families and caregivers and educational teams or medical teams, knowing about the neurological underpinnings of sensory integration really increases our credibility and our trustworthiness. So when we talk about a child's set of strengths and challenges, the more we can ground that in a solid knowledge of what's happening on a neurological level, the more we're going to be able to make sense to others. Now, given that, we're not going to stick with talking about, um, the medial lemniscus, right? We're not going to go into all of that jargon, but having that foundation is going to enable us to speak more skillfully to all of the people that interact with and spend time with that child and will be part of the intervention efforts. There's undoubtedly other reasons why we would study neuro, and we can talk about those when we get to the questions and answers. Okay, so factor analysis is the next topic I wanted to bring up briefly with you. And there was a number of questions that have come from the Module 1 survey that I reviewed, and many of them had to do with research behind sensory integration, either the abundance of research or the lack of research or a combination, and how we know what we know. So factor analysis, and there's two main factor analyses I'll speak to. Factor analysis is I'll read you the description and then I'll tell you what I make of that in common language. So factor analysis is a statistical method used to describe variability among observed correlated variables in terms of a potentially lower number of unobserved variables called factors. For example, is it possible that variations in 4 observed variables mainly reflect the variations in 2 unobserved variables? So that is a huge that is a huge mouthful, and in trying to make sense of it, and I'll do my best here. Factor analysis means we take what we see in our evaluations. So say we see that a kid is seeking vestibular input. They're also having difficulty with bilateral integration and sequencing. And they're also having difficulty with maintaining visual regard. Okay, so we do all of our testing, which may be the SIPT, it may be the EASY when that is fully finished. It also involves questionnaires and clinical observations. We take all of that information and we plug it into a statistical formula that reduces or narrows down what we're seeing into kind of patterns. And those patterns are called factors. So we may see vestibular seeking in a lot of different ways if we're working with a lot of kids. But when we evaluate children, we're going to say, is their vestibular system overreactive, underreactive? What are we seeing? And we're going to kind of characterize it. And this idea of factor analysis is that we take all of the things that we've measured and we distill it down into patterns that that exist across kids. And that's the important part. So it's not just one kid, it's a bunch of kids. And let me see. So it's important because it tells us, it gives us information about what's going on pattern-wise. And, when we're doing research to say, is our intervention, is our Ayres sensory intervention working? And we only measure one kid, we can say, well, yes, it worked for him or it worked for her, but how do we know if it's working in a larger context? So let's look at two factor analyses. They're kind of the two main ones, and I haven't taken Jean Ayres. I've taken the more modern ones. So the first one was Shelley Mulligan from 1998, and she had a sample of over 10,000 kids, which is huge. And what she did, she didn't actually work with 10,000 kids. She went to the charts of over 10,000 kids, and she looked at the assessment results. And she identified a number of factors. So in other words, she looked at all of these results, she plugged them into a statistical program, she crunched all the numbers, and this is what came out. Bilateral integration and sequencing was a pattern that she found, and it was a pattern based on certain results from the SIPT primarily, the sensory integration and praxis test. So certain patterns happened over and over again that indicated challenges with bilateral integration and sequencing, which was one of the terms that we talked about. She also found that there was a pattern that represented difficulties in somatopraxis. So somatopraxis, just as a refresher, is tactile and sometimes vestibular or proprioceptive input to the higher level structures. So the motor centers, for example. So the things that kind of we look at clinically are things like motor planning, sequencing, and projected or anticipatory movements. So projected movements have to do with, like, how does a kid move when they have to catch a ball? Or anticipatory movements, when they see the ball coming, do they move their body in order to be behind it so that they can actually catch it? So that's somatopraxis. She also found a pattern that represented challenges with visual praxis. And I don't know why they say visuopraxis, but it's visual praxis. So visual praxis has to do with perceiving form and space. It has to do with coordinating our eyes and our motor systems. And it has to do with constructing things with our hands based on what we see with our eyes. She also saw a pattern in somatosensory processing. So that has to do with tactile discrimination. In other words, the fine recognition and processing of touch sensation, also proprioception. And this comes from an all-around processing of tactile and proprioceptive inputs of all kinds. And finally, she saw a pattern with postular and ocular movement. So this has to do with the vestibular system, the ocular system, the vestibular spinal system, and the proprioceptive system, and the processing of all of those inputs. So she took all of the things that were seen in the evaluation and seen clinically, and she reduced them down to these 5 patterns of stuff basically that can challenge kids or represent sensory integration difficulties. The second factor analysis study was from Zoe Malo, who you know, and colleagues in 2011. They had a smaller sample. It was 273, but still a reasonable size sample. And the factors that they identified were very similar to the factors that were identified by Mulligan, which is a good thing because we want to see consistency across these studies. It means that the patterns that we're seeing really are the patterns that exist. So again, visuo and somatosensory praxis, or dyspraxia, meaning difficulty with praxis. Vestibular and bilateral integration and sequencing, so same pattern. Tactile and visual discrimination, which is, again, very similar. And then one that wasn't identified by Mulligan, which was tactile defensiveness and attention difficulties. So this has to do with our reactivity. The first 3 are more about praxis and skilled motor, and this 4th one is about reactivity or modulation. Okay, so that brings us, and we're, I believe, 1 or 2 slides from the end. Yep, 1 slide from the end. So we'll close with this, that when we're thinking about sensory integration, and this was true for me for a long, long time, that I couldn't quite wrap my head around the fact that there was these 2 outcomes of sensory integration. One had to do with praxis or motor ability, and in this slide, I'm representing that by this little kid who's on a surfboard, right? So motor coordination, sequencing, bilateral integration, ability to balance, ability to know where his body is in space, coordinate eyes and body. The whole thing is coming together, right? And that's praxis versus modulation. In other words, this idea of reactivity. So the self-regulatory outcomes of sensory integration. And currently, for OTs, we're much more focused on that a child has difficulty with movement. They have difficulty sitting still. They might be defensive with noises or tastes or smells. We see a lot of feeding issues that are sensory based. So reactivity or modulation has to do with a separate piece of sensory integration. They're related, but there's two kind of main camps, and one has to do with motor and the other has to do with self-regulation, also known as modulation, also known as reactivity. Okay, so for today, a lot of questions came in, again, from this sensory survey that had to do with assessment and treatment, and I'm happy to field those. But as much as is possible, I'd love to stay focused, at least in part, on the idea of theory, the sensory systems, patterns of dysfunction, in other words, the factors we talked about, bilateral integration, praxis, reactivity, etc. But I'm happy to field whatever questions you have. So that's what I have, and we have about a half an hour to talk about your questions. So again, you can either unmute your mic and ask me directly, or you can type your question. And Lauren, I see that you're maybe talking.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, welcome.
Okay, great. Hi, thank you so much. I think one of the questions I have about, the theory and sensory integration in general is I work part-time in a sensory gym and part-time in a school-based setting, in a general, elementary school.
Sure.
And I think I have a really hard time kind of bringing some of the theory into the school-based setting because it's so academically driven and there isn't the time and the resource to, affect change the way that I would like to, like I can in a sensory gym. So I think my question and what I'm always kind of floundering and struggling with in the school setting is kind of what is the easiest way to kind of apply, and I guess we'll talk about application more, but the best way to kind of bring in some of this theory to school-based OT.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And what state are you in, just for the heck of it?
I'm in New York, Long Island.
Excellent. So I worked school-based for, 10, 12 years, and so I understand that difficulty. And I think to a great extent it has to do with, there's different cultures at different schools and in different regions. And so to start with, education and sort of a slow, ongoing educational efforts are what is going to make the difference in terms of getting school-based personnel on board with sensory integration. In some instances, I would not even call what I was talking about sensory integration. I would simply talk about sensory motor. And I suggest that you reduce it down to the idea that we take in information from all of our senses, we process that information in our brains, and then we're able to do motor activity. And so that very basic that very basic idea can be built upon, of course, but it is the foundation from which we get fine motor, which everybody is quite concerned about in school-based practice. It also enables us to deal with posture and postural stability, which is going to be the precursor to fine motor skill building. And that's where I start, is just how that piece fits together. Then I can go into the various sensory systems with a little bit more depth. And I take the ones that are a little more intuitive, visual, and then I don't even necessarily talk about vestibular and proprioceptive function. I will introduce those terms, but to start with, I talk about the visual system because that's super central and everybody understands that much more intuitively. And then I'll pull in our sense of balance, right? And how important our sense of balance is. Then I'll pull in how important our sense of body awareness is. And so I remove the lingo. I start with this sensory in, brain processing, motor out, and then I build from there. And depending on where the issues with the kids are, I will go into the reactivity, and I again talk in as, and I'm not saying like talk down to anybody by any means, but I'll talk as simply as possible about why reactivity happens and what we can do about it. Does that,
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
yeah. Okay. Follow up, or is that address your question well enough?
No, that definitely addresses it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and and look at it as a long-term project rather than I'm going to do one in-service or one workshop or even two workshops, but that slowly but surely, as you're seeing things in the classroom, you can point them out and use it as a teachable moment and use it as an opportunity to model strategies that are going to help. And then the theory simply underlines, hey, I'm doing this strategy. Want to know why it works? Here's why. But it's
okay, gotcha.
And it is a process of educating teams and staff, just as we educate people about what the heck OT is.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Ivy, who has been waiting patiently. Her question is, would you please kindly explain from the neuroscience aspect how the SI activities correct sensory reactivity like high threshold or low threshold? I mean, how the reticular formation, limbic system, or autonomic nervous system change after SI activities. Thanks. So, Ivy, you ask the core question of all questions, and I'm going to need to back up just a teeny bit from your question and then work my way up to it. Okay. So, to some extent, what we're after with sensory integration intervention is that we reset the threshold of reactivity of the nervous system. And we do that by supporting the weaker systems with the stronger systems. For example, if we have a kid who has auditory hyperresponsivity and vestibular hyperresponsivity, and they seek proprioception. Are you with me? And you could just type a Y or an N. Cool. Okay, so we have this kid, and this is just one example. So we have this kid, and ultimately what we want to do is we want to put in place activities over time that will change the firing point of the nervous system, right? So they're going to change the firing point of those action potentials. We do this by giving the systems that are having a really hard time a little bit of a break and recruiting the systems that are working better. In this case, the auditory and the vestibular system are really having a difficult time, and they're hyperreactivity. So they fire at the drop of a hat. It's very easy to get them charged up and going, and so much so that they're doing it in an atypical or abnormal fashion. So what we're going to try to do is recruit the visual system, the proprioceptive system, and depending on how the tactile system is doing, if it's doing pretty well, we'll also recruit the tactile system and use those systems, because we can never talk about just one sensory system or a sense in isolation of all senses. We do that, but it's very artificial. All of our systems exist inside of us, and they're all working all the time. They might not be working well, but they're all working all the time. So our breaking them into pieces and parts is actually super artificial. So we have these senses that are not working well. We have the senses that are working very well, or at least better. And so we're going to recruit the systems that are working better, especially those systems like the proprioceptive system that are inherently downregulating or calming to the nervous system. And so the idea is that over time, new neuronal pathways will get formed and strengthened that will enable the child to not have quite such a low threshold for reactivity in various systems, in this case, vestibular and auditory. Now, you ask about the reticular formation, the limbic system, the autonomic nervous system, and how they change. We don't actually have enough research, and that's why research is so important. We don't have enough research to say we're going to do, the best way to go about this is 3 times a week for 1 hour for 6 months, and this kid is going to experience neuroplasticity. We do not have any of that information beyond a shadow of a doubt. We have the start of some of that information, but we're a long way from really being able to operationalize what works the best and why. Now, consider as well that we're dealing with individual children who may have a lot of other things going on. They may be on the autism spectrum. They may have ADHD. They may have Fragile X syndrome. They may have nothing else going on, or nothing else that we can really identify. So we're not even all that clear about where the sensory integration challenges arise from in all kids, and it may be different for different children. So getting to the point of knowing how much, when, where, and in what amounts is not where we're at yet. However, we know that over time, with therapy, the results are very positive. They're not beyond a shadow of a doubt, and that's, to go back to Lauren's question a little bit, that's part of the reason why I believe, and this is my opinion at this point, that school districts and other professionals have a difficult time believing us when we say, hey, this is a really powerful approach and treatment methodology, is that we don't yet have a very robust set of studies, and we're working on it, and we're working on it faster than ever before. So that said, the reticular formation is going to be mostly involved in it has a role in wake-sleep cycles. It has a role in how aroused, and I don't mean sexual arousal, but just alertness, how alert we are or not. So we're not going to be able to pull out, like, we're only going to target the reticular formation, or we're only going to target the limbic system, but they work in concert. So we have this idea of a system that helps us regulate alertness and arousal, and then the limbic system is going to be implicated, and we may think to ourselves when we see a lot of emotional reactivity that goes along with the sensory reactivity that that system is really implicated. And the autonomic nervous system is primarily associated with with a low threshold, a low firing threshold, and the sympathetic part of it is what we mostly see with a low threshold. And then with a high threshold, I want to say that that it's not quite the autonomic nervous system that's 100% at the root of that, because the the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for maintaining homeostasis. And a low threshold is not homeostasis, right? A high threshold or underreactivity is not the opposite um, of the sympathetic nervous system going. So I don't think that we can say that. However, all of those systems are going to be working at the same time when we're looking to correct sensory reactivity. So first and foremost, we're looking at Ayres SI to actually change the nervous system through neuroplasticity and through those channels. But, we live in the real world. And so we're also going to look at how can we adapt the environment and how can we change the way that a child or an adult does activities so that those those systems that are going to fire really hard and really often with not a lot of input are actually less triggered. So that's going to help as well. And then I told you it was the big question. So one more part, which is when we take into account kids that are under, say, about 8 or 9 years old, they're really in a very sensory motor phase of development, and the prefrontal cortex, in other words, that area of the brain that's very responsible for inhibition of the nervous system, in other words, not responding and not reacting to every sensation that comes in and is registered, that kicks in. And so age and stage of development can also make a huge difference in terms of how much reactivity we're seeing on the outside and also how the child is dealing with that reactivity. So, tell me what else you would like to know about that, and if that just my explanation now raised another set of questions. And I'm happy to have you type or hear from you. And I see Teresa raised her hand, so go ahead.
Me? Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Oh, okay. Hey,
Hi.
hi, Melissa. You raised an important point before when you said there was two schools with reactivity versus, hang on, going back to my notes.
Uh-huh.
Is that you mean two separate outcomes or two carryovers from the ASI approach?
Yeah. So
Reactivity
praxis,
versus the motor?
right.
It's actually two schools of thought that we see here.
Yeah. So, so consider this, that when we think about the sensory integration and praxis tests, and there's a clue in there, praxis tests, right? Jean Ayres was looking at kids between 4 and 8 years of age, approximately, who had praxis issues. In other words, they had some incoordination, they had difficulty using their motor systems and engaging in motor activity of all sorts in a typical fashion. Okay, so in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s a little bit, that was the what we associated sensory integration with. You have good sensory integration. You also you can see good sensory integration from skilled motor engagement and participation. Does that piece make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great. So then Along comes this idea of reactivity or modulation or self-regulation, and I'm using those terms interchangeably. And now we have kids who have great motor skills, but they're super uncomfortable because they are seeking movement all the time and they can't sit still, or they are seeking proprioception because they have poor body awareness and they're crashing and banging into things, right? And they're trying to calm themselves down. So now we have a situation where we have kids who have motor issues, and we have kids who have this reactivity issues, which may or may not be associated with motor skill. And in fact, I'll correct myself right here. So take the proprioceptive system, for example. I just said somebody with poor body awareness, right? So proprioceptive system, poor body awareness, would be seen as difficulty with praxis or difficulty with motor skill. But there's other kids that are fleeing themselves off the top of things and crashing all the time in an effort to calm themselves down or self-regulate, right? So one system, the proprioceptive system, and it has implications both for our ability to engage in skilled motor and our ability to self-regulate. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it's interesting because it raises another question too. Sorry
Sure.
to jump in, but we're also seeing kids referred to as yes because a lot of parents understand about sensory reactivity.
Yes.
But also now there's the ASI. So it's actually pretty cool to take my roots back to SI because I think there's a lot of important.
Yes, exactly. So, with sensory integration, it's a very loaded topic still. It used to be that it was almost 100% associated with motor skill, and then it went to reactivity. And now we're seeing, hey, a kid could have difficulty with motor skill, they could have difficulty with self-regulation because of reactivity, or they could have difficulty with both. And the central issue could be sensory processing and integration, or it could be something else entirely. So we want to be able to differentiate between difficulties with praxis and difficulties with over or under reactivity, and when we see what clinically. Okay, thanks, Teresa. So Ivy has posted another question. Would you please kindly explain from a neuroscience aspect why applying deep pressure could make the kids become more organized and calm? So activating we know that deep pressure and proprioception, so the somatosensory system, it's got inputs from the tactile system and input from the proprioceptive system. So deep pressure has to do with both. It can be on the surface of the skin. It can also be deep pressure that compresses the joints or provides inputs to the muscles, where we then bring in or recruit the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs and the receptors that are in the proprioceptive system. So where those receptors go is, at least in large part, to the reticular activating system, or the reticular formation, as you say, which is responsible for how alert or aroused we are or how calm we are. And so when we apply deep pressure or encourage kids to engage in activities that activate the proprioceptive system, that some of what the input is doing is going to the parts of the nervous system, including the reticular formation, that are responsible for calming and organizing the nervous system. Pretty cool, right? Sure. And it's almost 6:30. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes if someone else has another question. Oh boy, my screen says multiple attendees are typing. So we'll try to get to as many of you as possible. And welcome, Alfred. I see that you've joined us. Okay, so I see a question from Jennifer. Just real quick, can you please explain the difference or relationship between visuopraxis and constructional praxis? So real quick, visuopraxis is a more of an umbrella term. So the whole aspect of visual system as it relates to skilled motor, and constructional praxis is a very particular piece of it, and and also a way of measuring, right? So constructional praxis makes me think of putting together blocks from looking at a picture, a model, right? So it's going to demonstrate visuopraxis. Does that make sense? You're welcome. Okay, and Lauren wants to know, is there any research as to how nutrition affects self-modulation? This is a little bit separate from sensory integration, but certainly, as occupational therapists, which I'm assuming most of you are in the field of OT, and please let me know if that's not a safe assumption. There's actually quite a bit of research coming out that looks at the effect of sugar on the body, right? And so that would be where I would look to find information about nutrition and self-modulation. We know that poor nutrition definitely affects self-modulation because we're not getting all the nutrients we need to feed the brain and feed the body. But the newest research mostly is around sugar, and to some extent also gluten and wheat and other foods that have inflammatory properties. Okay, and Ivy would like to know, what are the neural functions reflecting plasticity? And I'm not sure what your question is. So I will just say that what I think that you're talking about is, how are things going to change neurally that reflect neuroplasticity? And what I would say is, as therapists and clinicians, what we're going to see is we're going to see changes in praxis or skilled motor, and we're going to see changes in reactivity. In other words, less reactivity if someone is overreactive, and more reactivity if someone is under registering sensory input. So we're not going to be able to measure the actual neural functions, although there is a whole kind of subset of sensory integration research that looks at how reactive the nervous system is, and they measure brain waves, and they also measure, and I'm forgetting the term for it, but it's basically the sweat on the surface of your skin, and it's a very, very sensitive test. So it's not like I bust out sweating because I'm so overreactive, but it's a very, very fine test that will measure that. And so there are OTs that are doing that, and there are also neurologists that are doing that. And I would direct you to University of California, San Francisco has a neurologist that's working on that area. And I could get you the name and post it for you. It's not on the tip of my tongue right now. Okay, and Alfred asks, I work at a school setting and there are kids who always have self-stimulation. Should we allow such behavior and observe if the kids have enough stimulations and direct them back to school activities? So I am assuming that you're talking about children who are on the autism spectrum, but I'm not sure. And you know, it's again, it's moving away a little bit. Thanks, Alfred, for that clarification. So it is moving away a little bit from sensory integration and theory. But what I'll say about it is that self-stimulatory behaviors are providing something valuable to those kids. My approach has always been that if I try to extinguish self-stimulatory behavior entirely, it will pop out in another way. For example, if kids are flapping their arms and I make them stop flapping, they will start spinning. If kids are spinning and the team quote unquote makes them stop spinning, it will come out in another way. And so what I do around that kind of behavior is more set a time and a place where it is not disruptive and it is not super socially inappropriate, and look at offering that kind of time, that kind of downtime for the kid. And I also look at what is causing the behavior. So the behavior doesn't happen for no reason. The behavior happens because of something. And so if a kid is stimming, for example, and we look at the larger setting and we see that anytime he is called upon to actually perform. Thanks, Sarah. Take care. Hope to cross paths with you again. So if the self-stimulatory behavior has a pattern and it's occurring for a particular reason, then we look at changing what's underlying it in order to reduce it, rather than artificially saying, no, don't do that anymore, because it is serving a purpose. You're welcome. All right, so we're at 6:36. I'm happy to stick around, but I know that for some of you it's early in the morning. For some of you it's late at night, and I want to respect that. I really appreciate you coming today, and please do let me know if you have more questions. Katie can put the PowerPoint into a PDF format and post it for you. And here is my contact information should you wish to email me. And I very much enjoyed working with you and look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I just wanted to share that we will be doing several more of these discussions in this series. We're delighted to have Melissa back next month to host another one of these sessions. And we will be sending out the link to this recording in case you want to view it again. And in that same email, we'll announce the date of the next session. So we hope that you can join then. And again, I just want to give a great big thank you to Melissa. That was fantastic. And I hope all of you can join next time. Thank you.